The day Evelyn Mercer stepped off the stage in Dry Creek Ridge, 3 men laughed at her, not behind her back, to her face. Right there in the dirt street, dust still settling around her boots. She had a deed in one hand and a dented coffee pot in the other, and every single soul in that town was certain she'd be gone inside of a month. They'd seen it before. City people with big ideas and no calluses. They always left. But Evelyn Mercer wasn't most people. And this is the story of what she did instead. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. The stagecoach pulled it into Dry Creek Ridge just past 2 in the afternoon on the last Tuesday of September, 1878, and the town received it the way it received most things, with suspicion and very little ceremony. Evelyn Mercer was the only passenger who climbed down at the Dry Creek stop. The driver handed her a single trunk, a canvas bag, and a battered coffee pot that had seen better decades, then clicked his tongue at the horses before she'd even gotten her footing in the dust. She stood in the middle of the rutted street and looked around at what was supposed to be her new home. It wasn't much to look at. Dry Creek Ridge consisted of maybe 40 structures, if you counted the ones that were more suggestion than building. A general store, a feed and grain, a blacksmith with a collapsed awning, 2 saloons that faced each other like old enemies across the main road, a small post office, and a scattering of homes and outbuildings that fanned out from the main street in no particular order. The whole settlement sat in the middle of a wide, flat stretch of Nebraska grassland so featureless that the sky seemed to press down on it from every direction. 3 men were sitting outside the first saloon on a bench, worn pale from years of use. They looked at Evelyn the way people look at something that doesn't quite fit where it's been placed. "You lost, miss?" one of them called out. His name was Hank Pruitt. He ran the feed and grain and had opinions about nearly everything. "No," Evelyn said. She didn't elaborate. The 3 of them watched her look up and down the street. She was somewhere in her late 20s, wearing clothes that were clean and well-made, but clearly meant for a different kind of life. A dark blue traveling dress with small buttons down the front, low-heeled boots that were already dusty. Her hair was pinned up and mostly still in place after what had clearly been a long trip. She had a leather satchel over one shoulder, and she was holding that coffee pot like she intended to keep it. One of the other men, a younger fellow named Cal Briggs, who worked the blacksmith's bellows, leaned over and said something low, and all 3 of them laughed. Evelyn heard it. She didn't look at them. She picked up her trunk by the handle and started dragging it toward the general store. The man behind the counter was Olin Meeks, who had run the Dry Creek General Store for 11 years, and who prided himself on knowing everyone's business. He was a thin man with a sparse mustache and the kind of watchfulness that came from spending too much time being the first person newcomers walked up to. "Help you?" he said, though his expression suggested the question was more complicated than it sounded. "I'm looking for a man named Hargrove," Evelyn said. "He wrote to me about keys." Olin blinked. "Cass Hargrove?" "I don't know his first name. He's a land agent." "That's Cass," Olin said, and something in his face shifted. A flicker of something like pity, though he tried to cover it. "He'd be at the post office this time of day, usually, but—" He paused. "Can I ask what your business is, miss?" Evelyn set her satchel on the counter and pulled out a folded envelope. She placed it in front of him. "I bought the Alderman parcel, the 160 acres on the northeast side." Olin Meeks stared at the envelope. He did not pick it up. Then he looked at her city clothes, her coffee pot, her complete lack of a wagon, a horse, any equipment whatsoever. And he said very carefully, "The Alderman parcel. That's right. Miss Mercer. Evelyn Mercer. Miss Mercer." He cleared his throat. "The Alderman land has been sitting empty for 3 years. There's a reason for that." "I know," she said. She picked the envelope back up. "Where's the post office?" Cass Hargrove was a round-shouldered man with ink stains on his fingers who looked profoundly uncomfortable when Evelyn walked through his door. He'd been corresponding with her for 6 months. He had, in that time, not mentioned several things. He had not mentioned that the sod house on the property had a wall that was leaning in a direction walls were not meant to lean. He had not mentioned that the well casing was cracked and the water was unreliable at best. He had not mentioned that the previous owner, a homesteader named Alderman, had abandoned the property after 2 failed harvests and a broken leg, and that Alderman had told anyone who would listen that the land was cursed, which it wasn't, but the story had stuck anyway. He gave her the keys, 2 of them, on a wire ring. and talked very quickly about boundary markers and water rights and the nearest claims on either side. Evelyn let him talk. When he ran out of things to say, she asked him if there was a livery in town. "Rob's," he said. "South End. I need to hire a wagon for the afternoon, and a man who knows the road to the Alderman parcel." Cass Hargrove looked at her with the expression of a man who wanted very much to say something but had already been paid, and therefore had limited standing. "I can write you directions," he said. "I'd rather a man." He found her one. A teenage boy named Percy Alderson, no relation to the former owner, who drove her out to the property in a borrowed wagon with the particular silence of someone who has been told not to say anything discouraging but isn't sure he can manage it. The land was 3 miles northeast of town, accessed by a rutted track that had been grown over along the edges. Percy pulled the wagon up in front of the sod house and sat there with his hands in his lap. Evelyn got down and stood in front of the structure. It was a one-room soddy, maybe 16 feet by 20, with a low roof and a door that hung slightly crooked in its frame. One exterior wall had developed a slow inward lean at the top. Not dramatic, but visible. The grass on the roof had grown wild and was beginning to brown. There was a small window on the south wall with a shutter that had been nailed shut. Around the building, the remains of a fence ran in 3 directions, most of the posts either rotted off at the ground or leaning at angles that had nothing to do with plumb. The well was 20 feet from the front door, and Evelyn could see from where she stood that the wooden casing around its mouth had cracked and partially collapsed inward. She stood there looking at it for a long moment. "Ma'am," Percy said, very carefully, from the wagon seat. "You want me to wait?" "Yes," she said. "I'm going inside." She used one of the keys on the front door. It stuck, then gave. The inside was dim and smelled of old dust and something vaguely mineral that she couldn't name. A small iron stove sat against the back wall, its pipe rising through the ceiling. There was a wooden shelf on one wall, a sleeping platform built into one corner. A mouse had been living in the shelf, based on the evidence. Evelyn stood in the middle of the floor and turned slowly and looked at every wall, every corner, the low ceiling, the uneven earthen floor. Then she went back outside and sat on the top step of the wooden stoop. One of the boards was soft, she'd feel that later, and looked out across the 160 acres that were hers. The land was flat and grassed over. In the far distance, maybe 2 miles out, the sky was beginning to pile up with clouds that had the bruised yellowish color of weather coming in. To the west, she could see the thin line of what she figured was a drainage draw, and beyond that, a neighbor's fence line, the posts straight and solid, everything neat and maintained. Percy Alderson was watching her from the wagon. "How bad is the well?" she asked. "My pa said it's salvageable," Percy said. He paused. "He said it when you were signing the papers. But he was talking to Mr. Hargrove." "Did he say anything else?" Percy was quiet for a beat too long. "He said you wouldn't last past February." Evelyn nodded slowly. She looked back at the land. The clouds were moving in. "Well," she said, and she stood up and picked up the coffee pot she'd set on the step beside her. "I suppose we'll see about that." She spent the rest of that afternoon making an inventory, not of what needed to be fixed. She already knew that was everything. She was making a list of what was still functional, what could be repaired without materials she didn't have yet, and what was dangerously broken enough that it needed attention before she slept in the building. The stove worked. She cleaned the flue with a rag on a stick and built a small fire to check the draw. It was slow but functional. The sleeping platform was solid. Whoever had built it had used good heavy lumber and it hadn't shifted. The door she rehung herself, shaving the top edge with a knife until it cleared the frame and swung properly. The soft board on the stoop she propped up and marked for replacement. The well she didn't touch. She looked down it with a lantern and saw water, maybe 15 feet down, which was good, but the cracked casing was dropping small pieces of dried wood and sod into the water, which was not. She'd need help with that. Percy helped her carry in her trunk before driving back to town. Before he left, she paid him a full day's rate, even though it was half a day. He seemed surprised by this. He also seemed, she thought, slightly less confident that she'd be gone by February. She ate that first evening from the provisions she'd packed in the canvas bag: hardtack, dried apples, a wedge of hard cheese she'd bought in the last town the stage had stopped through. She heated water on the stove and made coffee in that battered pot, which was the only thing she'd brought from Boston that had belonged to her mother. And she sat on the sleeping platform with a wool blanket around her shoulders and listened to the wind come up outside. The plains wind was different from any wind she'd heard before. In Boston, there were buildings and trees and the water to break it up, to give it shape. Out here, it came across nothing, building from the horizon, and when it hit the sod walls of the house, it made a sound like something very large pressing against the structure from the outside. The walls held. She'd half expected them not to. She didn't sleep well, but she slept. The first week set the pattern for most of what followed. Evelyn made the 8-mile round trip to Dry Creek Ridge every other day in the beginning, borrowing a horse from Rob's livery for a fee she couldn't quite afford to keep paying. She bought materials in small quantities because that was what she could carry alone. A coil of wire, a bag of nails, a length of chain, a block of rendered tallow for sealing gaps in the walls. She read what she could find. A 2-year-old almanac she found on Olin Meeks's back shelf, a worn pamphlet about dryland farming that had been left at the post office by someone passing through. People watched her, mostly without speaking to her. The women of Dry Creek Ridge had a way of looking at her across the dry goods aisle that was not quite unfriendly and not quite welcoming either. More like observation. A form of judgment that would be withheld until they knew more, or until she'd proven herself either worth knowing or worth dismissing. A few of them introduced themselves. A woman named Doris Kinzel, whose husband ran cattle about 5 miles west, was the first to speak to her without it feeling like an evaluation. She was a plain-spoken woman about 40, with cracked hands and a direct gaze, and she asked Evelyn what she was planting in the spring. "Wheat to start," Evelyn said. "I'm thinking winter rye if I can get the seed." Doris Kinzel looked at her for a moment. "You know anything about wheat?" "I read everything I could find in Boston. I know the theory." "Theory," Doris said, in a tone that was not quite dismissive, but held a careful distance from encouragement. "You'll need more than that." "I know," Evelyn said. "I'm hoping to trade for some of the practical knowledge." Something shifted in Doris Kinzel's expression. Not warmth exactly, but a crack in the neutral assessment. "Come find me when you've got your soil worked," she said. "I'll tell you what grows here and what doesn't." It was the most useful conversation Evelyn had in her first month. That's it. Victor Hale came to see her on a Thursday in early October, which she knew because she'd started keeping a journal by then, writing down everything she'd done each day. What she'd repaired, what she'd planted, how much water the well gave before it started running cloudy, how the stove performed at different temperatures. He rode in from the south on a horse that cost more than her land deed, accompanied by a man who stayed back 20 feet and never introduced himself. Hale himself was in his mid-50s, thick through the chest, with a broad face and the kind of easy assurance that came from decades of having things go his way. He wore a good coat and good boots, and he carried himself the way men carried themselves when they were accustomed to owning the room. He stopped his horse near the well and looked around at the property with an expression that was almost paternal, concerned, patient, slightly sad. "Miss Mercer," he said. He'd done his homework. "I'm Victor Hale. I run the Box H cattle operation about 12 miles southeast." Evelyn had been digging out the fence post line along the northern edge. She had a post hole digger in her hands and her sleeves rolled to the elbow. She was aware that she had dirt on her face and didn't particularly care. "Mr. Hale," she said. He looked at the leaning wall of the sod house, then the well, then the fence. He did this slowly, making sure she saw him doing it, which she recognized as a deliberate rhetorical choice. "I'll be direct," he said. "I've been trying to acquire this parcel for 2 years. The Alderman family wouldn't deal, and then they left. And by the time the land went back through the courts, you'd already put in an offer." He paused. "I'd like to buy it from you." Evelyn leaned the post hole digger against a fence post. "It's not for sale." He smiled in a way that suggested he'd expected that answer. "Miss Mercer, I don't say this to be cruel, but I've watched a dozen homesteaders come through this county with the same kind of determination, and I've watched nearly all of them leave. This land has problems that go beyond what one person can fix." He looked at the well again. "That casing alone." "I know about the well," she said. "The soil in the northeast quadrant drains wrong. It's been waterlogged in wet years and bone dry in dry ones. Whoever staked this claim picked the worst quarter section in the survey." "Possibly," Evelyn said. "What's your offer?" He told her. It was a fair number. More than she'd paid, and more than the land was currently worth in its condition. It was the kind of number that made the math very simple if you were looking at it from the outside. She thought about it for just long enough that he thought she might be considering it. "No, thank you," she said. Hale's expression didn't change much, but something in it became less warm. Is it a matter of price? It's a matter of the land being mine, she said. I appreciate the offer. He sat on his horse looking at her for a moment. The man behind him had edged his horse slightly forward, without quite meaning to, which told her something about what happened when Victor Hale got answers he didn't want. Well, Hale said, and his voice had flattened out a degree, I expect the offer will stand for a while yet. I'll keep that in mind, Evelyn said. She watched them ride south. Then she picked up the post-hole digger and went back to work. Gideon Ashcroft. She knew the name before she knew the man. She'd been in his lumberyard twice for materials, and both times he'd been out. The yard was run on those days by a young man named Dale, who had a gap between his front teeth and who gave her fair prices without her asking. The third time she went in, Gideon was there. He was older than she'd expected from the way people said his name. Somewhere in his mid-50s, broad and weathered, with thick gray-threaded hair and hands that looked like they'd been working since before she was born. He had a deliberate, unhurried way about him. He didn't say much when she came in, just listened to what she needed and walked her through the yard to the lumber that would work best for her purpose. She needed boards for shoring up the interior of the well casing, longer pieces, seasoned wood that wouldn't warp. You doing this yourself? He said. I'd hire someone, but I haven't found anyone who wants the work at a price I can manage. He looked at the list she'd handed him. He made a small adjustment to one of the lengths she'd asked for, explaining briefly why the longer piece would hold better against the earth pressure. She recognized immediately that he was right. Any experience with well casings? He said. None, she said. I've been reading. He nodded once, the way a person nods when they're deciding something. He cut her the lumber at a price she didn't argue with, though she suspected later it was lower than it should have been. He helped her load it into the rented wagon without being asked. As she was leaving, he said, without looking up from what he was doing, the casing angle matters more than the depth. If you don't get it plumb, it'll just pull apart again. All right, she said. Someone ought to check it when you're done. She drove back to the homestead. 2 days later, she had the interior of the well cased and braced as plumb as she could get it on her own, and she hauled water that afternoon that ran clear from top to bottom. She wrote about it in her journal. Well repaired. Water runs clear. Used Ashcroft cedar planks. Good wood. October turned cold early. The temperature dropped the second week of the month and came back up, then dropped again the third week and didn't fully recover. The plains in autumn had a particular quality that she was just beginning to understand. The light changed first, going from the bright, sharp light of summer to something lower and more oblique, and the grass changed with it, browning and flattening. The wind had teeth in it by October's end. She'd gotten the worst of the wall repaired by then. She'd learned to pack new sod in layers and let each one settle before adding the next, the way the original builders had done. She'd sealed most of the visible gaps with a mud and straw mixture she'd made herself from a recipe in the almanac. The leaning wall she'd buttressed from the inside with a diagonal brace made from 2 of Gideon's boards, which stopped the lean and would hold through the winter if nothing knocked it from the outside. She was not comfortable exactly, but she was not in immediate danger of freezing, which was what mattered. The first real snow came on November 3rd. She woke to a changed quality of light through the shutter gap and knew before she opened the door. About 4 inches, not bad. It had blown in from the northwest and piled against the northwest corner of the house, but the roof held and the door swung clear. She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking out at the white-covered land. The sky was a flat gray that went from horizon to horizon without interruption, and the grass that stuck up through the snow was a pale copper color, and the air was so cold it felt almost solid in the lungs. It was beautiful in a way that she hadn't been prepared for. She hadn't expected to find anything about this place beautiful. She made coffee. She stood outside with the cup in both hands and looked at the property. The northern fence line, which she'd been working on replacing post by post, disappeared into the white about 100 feet out. To the east, one of the old fence sections had partially collapsed under the snow's weight. 2 posts down, the wire bunched on the ground. She'd need to fix that before the cattle from the neighboring claim found it. She'd started coughing 3 days earlier. Not bad, just a dry hacking thing that woke her twice in the night. She'd had it before, back in Boston. A chest tendency that came out in cold weather. She told herself it would pass. It did not pass. But it also didn't get worse for a while, which she counted as good enough and kept working. She met most of the town over the first 2 months, the way you meet people in small places, gradually, through necessity, one transaction at a time. The woman who ran the post office was named Ada Wren, 50-ish, sharp-eyed, who sorted the mail with the efficiency of someone who knew everything that came in and out of the county and had opinions about all of it. The blacksmith whose awning had collapsed was Floyd Thane, who fixed things without enthusiasm, but well, and who after she'd been in twice started giving her honest estimates, instead of the inflated ones he gave strangers on principle. The 3 men who'd laughed at her the day she arrived, Hank Pruitt and the 2 others, remained the 3 men who laughed at her. She didn't avoid them, but she didn't seek them out. Hank Pruitt made a remark in the feed and grain the 3rd time she came in for supplies, something about city women and hard winters, and she looked at him steadily and said, "I'm still here, Mr. Pruitt," and he didn't have a good answer for that, so he went back to what he'd been doing. The woman she'd hoped would be a friend, Doris Kinsell, she saw only occasionally. Doris ran a tight operation with her husband and their 3 boys and didn't have much time for visiting, but when she saw Evelyn, she spoke to her directly and asked practical questions. How was the well holding? Had she gotten the north fence up? What did she plan for the south acreage? Break it for planting or let it lie fallow the first year? Evelyn always had answers. Doris seemed to appreciate that. What Evelyn didn't say to anyone, including Doris, was how much of each day was spent just managing the fear. Not panic. She wasn't a person prone to panic, but the steady, low-level weight of knowing exactly how close the margins were. How if the well failed, she had no backup. How if the stovepipe cracked during a hard freeze, she might not know until the cold was already inside the walls. How if she got sick, really sick, not just this nagging cough. There was no one to bring water or call for help. She was 3 miles from town on a road that could become impassable in a serious storm, and she had no horse of her own and no neighbors closer than a mile. She managed the fear the same way she managed everything else, by breaking it into smaller pieces and doing one thing at a time. At night, she wrote in the journal. Not about fear, about work, what she'd done, what she'd learned, what needed doing next. It was a way of making the days feel like something was accumulating even when progress was invisible. November 12th. Repaired south fence gap. Cut and split half a cord of wood from the draw timber. Stove running well, cough worse in mornings. Water running clear. November 18th. Found the eastern post line needs new wire for 40 feet. Rob's doesn't carry the gauge. We'll check with Ashcroft's yard on Thursday. November 23rd. First real freeze, 16 degrees by my reckoning. House held. Slept in my coat. Still here. On a cold Tuesday in late November, she came out in the early morning to find her broken fence section repaired. She stood in the snow looking at it for a full minute, certain she was seeing wrong. But no. The posts were set fresh and plumb, tamped in with packed earth that was slightly darker than the surrounding ground, and new wire was strung taut between them, stapled clean and tight. Someone had done it in the night or before first light, and done it right, with the kind of mechanical confidence that came from having done it 1,000 times. She looked around. The road to the northwest was empty, no tracks in the snow that she could see. It had blown enough overnight to cover any. She didn't know what to make of it. She stood there in the cold with her coffee pot in her hand and felt something complicated move through her. Gratitude, yes, but also a kind of unease, the feeling of being watched without quite knowing by what. She fixed the fence, she thought. Or someone did. The wire was her gauge. She recognized it from Ashcroft's yard. She didn't say anything to anyone about it at first. She kept it in the journal. November 24th. East fence repaired overnight. Not my work. Wire matches Ashcroft's stock. Don't know what to think. It happened twice more before December was out. A rotted post on the north line that she hadn't gotten to replaced. Solid new cedar, set deep. Then one morning she found a split cord of wood stacked against the north wall of the house, neatly split and covered with a piece of canvas weighted at the corners against the wind. She thought about it for a long time. She thought about who had the materials, the skill, and the hours in the day, or before the day, to do this without being seen. She thought about a man with steady hands and a direct manner who noticed things without being asked to and said exactly what he meant, and not one word more. She went to Ashcroft's yard on the first Thursday of December. He was there. He was doing something with a piece of molding at the back of the main building, and he looked up when she came in with the particular expression of a person who is not surprised but is listening. "The fence wire," she said, "and the wood. He looked at her. He didn't deny it or explain it. He just looked at her in the way he had, level and unhurried, as if he were letting her say what she needed to say. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No," he agreed. She stood there for a moment. "I'd like to pay for the materials, at least." "The posts were scrapped from a previous order," he said. "The wire was the end of a spool." He paused. "There's no charge for scrap." She understood that this was a complete answer and that he was not going to expand on it. She wasn't sure how she felt about that. It irritated her slightly, the way a person who does a good thing without wanting acknowledgement can be a little irritating to someone who feels indebted. "All right," she said. "Thank you, then." "Yep," said Gideon Ashcroft. She bought the lumber she'd come for and loaded it herself into the wagon while he watched from the doorway. He came out and lifted the heaviest piece without asking, setting it in the wagon bed with the ease of someone for whom 100-pound timber was merely 100-pound timber. "Your north brace," he said as she climbed up onto the seat. "Come spring, before the ground thaws, you'll want to reset the footing on the east post. The freeze-thaw cycle will work it loose." She looked at him. "How do you know which post?" "I looked," he said. She drove back to the homestead in the thin winter light, and she thought about that, the plainness of it, the simple, uncomplicated fact of a person who noticed and then did something about what they noticed, without announcement, without wanting anything back. She was 30 years old. She'd been engaged once, in Boston, to a man who made elaborate promises and fulfilled very few of them. She'd learned to distrust the gap between words and actions, had learned, in fact, to weight actions higher than almost anyone she'd met seemed to think they deserved. She thought about Gideon Ashcroft, who said almost nothing, and who had fixed her fence in the dark before she was awake. She thought, well, that's something. And she drove on through the cold toward her leaning house on the edge of the plains, with the wind at her back and December coming in hard from the north, and winter barely started, and everything still left to prove. She was still here. That was the thing none of them had counted on. Not Hank Pruitt, not Cass Hargrove, with his careful non-disclosures, not Victor Hale on his expensive horse, not Percy Alderson's father, who had given her until February. The stove was warm. The well ran clear. The fence held. She was still here. Winter did not ease into Dry Creek Ridge that year. It arrived like a verdict. The second week of December brought a 3-day blow that kept Evelyn inside the soddy for nearly 60 hours straight, burning wood at a rate that made her stomach tighten every time she fed the stove. The wind came from the northwest and didn't quit, a sustained, battering pressure against the walls that wasn't loud so much as constant, the way a headache is constant, wearing at the edges of everything. She read the almanac until she'd memorized the parts worth memorizing. She reinforced the shutter bracing with the spare nails she kept in a tin on the shelf. She did the arithmetic on her woodpile for the 4th time and got the same answer she didn't like. She was behind. Not catastrophically, but behind. The cough had settled into her chest in a way that no longer felt temporary. It was worst in the mornings, when the cold inside the house was still close to the cold outside, and the air had that dry mineral quality that made her lungs tighten on the first deep breath of the day. She'd start coughing before she was fully awake sometimes, rolling onto her side on the sleeping platform, with her hand pressed to her sternum like she could hold it in. She didn't write about the cough much in the journal. She wrote about the woodpile, the stove temperature, the well, the fence. She wrote about the problem with the southeast corner of the roof where the sod had compacted unevenly, and there was a gap that let cold air finger in along the top of the east wall. She wrote about what she needed to fix it and when she could get to town. She did not write, "I am scared the cough is something serious." She thought it, some nights, in the particular honesty that comes at 2 a.m. when you can't sleep and the wind is doing what the wind does. But she didn't write it. What she wrote instead, on December 14th, was cough persisting, not worse. Managing. Roof gap patched with mud mix, holding for now. Wood supply needs attention. Managing. That was the word she chose. She used it the way you use a word when you want to believe it. The town, when she got to it on the first clear day after the 3-day blow, felt simultaneously smaller and louder than usual. People were doing the post-storm inventory that small settlements did, checking on neighbors, calculating damage, comparing notes on how bad it had been. She heard fragments of this in the general store and the feed and grain, men talking in that compressed, understated way about lost livestock and collapsed outbuildings, and fences down across half the county. Hank Pruitt was holding court near the stove in the feed and grain, the way he did when there was news to circulate. He saw Evelyn come in and said, loudly enough for the room, "Still standing out there, Miss Mercer? I figured that old soddy blew flat." "Wall's held," she said. She moved past him toward the grain bins. 3 days, that storm," he said, to no one in particular and everyone in general. 3 days straight. Old place like that, sod like that. He shook his head. Most of those old alderman buildings were half rotted when he left them. She measured out the grain she needed and didn't respond. There was a woman near the fabric bolts, a younger woman she didn't know well, maybe 25 with a quiet face, who watched this exchange and then caught Evelyn's eye with a look that was not quite an apology for Hank Pruitt, but acknowledged that he was, in fact, Hank Pruitt. Evelyn gave her a small nod and went to settle her bill with Olin Meeks. At the counter, Olin was quieter than usual. He counted back her change carefully and then said, without looking up, "You get that roof gap seen to?" She looked at him. He wasn't the type to ask after her welfare unprompted. "Patched it," she said. "Why?" "Heard it shifted in the storm. One of the boys out that way." He stopped. "Never mind. Just asking." She thought about that on the drive back. One of the boys out that way. There was no one living out her way. The nearest claim was the Whitmore operation, a mile and a half southwest, and the Whitmore family kept to themselves entirely. She turned it over in her mind and couldn't get it to fit into anything that made complete sense. When she got home, she found a canvas-wrapped bundle leaning against the west wall of the house. Inside it, enough split pine to last a week, maybe more, and a small paper-wrapped brick of the thick tallow she used for wall sealing that she hadn't been able to find in town. No note. The canvas was Ashcroft's, but she recognized the weave and the way it was folded at the corners, the same as what had covered the wood before. She stood in the cold with the tallow in her hand and looked out at the empty road northwest. She felt something that was not quite gratitude and not quite something else. A complicated middle feeling, warm and slightly off balance, the feeling you get when someone does something kind for you that they had no obligation to do and that you cannot repay in kind and cannot pretend you don't notice. She put the tallow on the shelf and stacked the wood against the north wall and didn't say anything to anyone about it for a week. January came in gray and settled. The storms were less dramatic, but the cold was more sustained, a deep, bone-level cold that didn't move much for days at a time, sitting on the plains like something with weight. The well required more maintenance as the freeze-thaw cycle worked at the casing the way Gideon had said it would. She was down there every few days with the lantern and the long-handled brush she'd fashioned for clearing debris, checking the water level, listening for sounds in the casing that meant trouble. She was down in the well shaft one afternoon, not far, just far enough to get a good look at the east wall of the casing where she thought she'd heard a shift, when she heard boots on the frozen ground above her. "You oughtn't be in there alone," said Gideon's voice. She looked up. He was standing at the well's mouth, looking down at her with an expression that was somewhere between concern and the particular look a person gets when they've arrived just in time to see someone doing something imprudent. "I'm just checking the casing," she said. "I know what you're doing. What I'm saying is, you shouldn't do it alone. If that east wall gives while you're in there, I'll hear it before it gives." "Maybe," he said. "Come up." She came up, partly because he was right, and partly because she'd found what she came to find anyway. A small horizontal crack in the east wall that wasn't dangerous yet, but would need addressing. She stood at the top of the well and brushed the dried sod off her sleeves and told him what she'd found. He crouched down and looked in with the lantern, holding it at the angle that gave the most light on the east face. He was quiet for a while. "Cedar insert," he said. "1/4 inch, cut to bow outward against the pressure. Should hold till spring." "I can do that," she said. "I'll bring the cedar Thursday." He stood. He looked at the well, then at the house, then, briefly, at her. "The cough any better?" She was surprised enough that she answered before she thought about it. "Some days," she said. "Not all days." He nodded once. He seemed about to say something else, then decided against it, which was very much in character for him. He looked at the casing repair one more time, like he was making sure he had it right in his head, and then said, "Thursday," and walked back to where he'd left his horse. She watched him ride northwest until he was a small shape against the gray sky. She thought, he came out here specifically. 3 miles from town in January. He hadn't been passing by. There was nothing out here to pass by on the way, too. He'd come because he knew she'd be checking the well when the temperature had been doing what the temperature had been doing, and he'd come to make sure she didn't do it alone. She went inside and made coffee and sat with it for a long time. She wasn't a person who felt lonely often. She'd chosen this deliberately. The homestead, the solitude, the hard work of building something that was hers. She'd chosen it partly because the alternative had been staying in Boston and marrying the kind of man Boston offered, and she'd tried that direction and it had gone badly. She didn't romanticize isolation, but she'd also made a kind of uneasy peace with it. The way you make peace with a thing that costs you but that you still prefer to the alternatives. Gideon Ashcroft was complicating that peace, and she wasn't entirely sure what to do about that. She got sick in the second week of January. Really sick, not the managed nuisance of the cough. Fever, the kind that came in waves and left her weak between them, sweating through the night and then bone cold by morning. She kept the stove going because she understood that if the fire went out while she was like this, she was in real trouble. And she drank water constantly even when she didn't want it, and she slept more than she had since she arrived. Doris Kinzel found out on the third day. Evelyn didn't know how. She hadn't told anyone. But Doris arrived at the Saudi on a gray Tuesday afternoon with a covered pot and an expression that was brisk and completely uninterested in being thanked. "Someone said you hadn't been to town," Doris said. She came inside without being invited and set the pot on the stove to heat. "How long?" "3 days," Evelyn said. She was sitting on the sleeping platform with a blanket, and she was aware that she looked terrible. Doris looked at her with the clinical eye of a woman who had nursed 3 children and 1 husband through various ailments and had no patience for understatement. "Fever break yet?" "Last night, maybe. I'm not sure." "Eat something." She ladled broth from the pot into the single bowl Evelyn owned and set it on the shelf beside the platform. "All of it." "Doris?" "All of it." Evelyn ate the broth. It was good, thick, with something in it that tasted like onion and dried herbs, and it sat in her stomach with the warm, settled feeling of something her body actually needed. Doris moved around the room while she ate, checking things without appearing to check things. She looked at the woodpile in the corner, the water bucket, the stove. She didn't comment on any of it, which meant things were acceptable. When Evelyn had finished the broth, she took the bowl back without ceremony and refilled it. "You been out to the well like this?" Doris said. "No." "Good." She paused. "Ashcroft came by the store 2 days ago asking if anyone had seen you in town." Evelyn looked at her. "He wasn't making a thing of it," Doris said, with the neutral precision of a woman who is conveying information and not editorializing. "Just asked." "Oh," said Evelyn. Doris looked at her, that direct reading gaze. "He's a good man," she said. "Has been since his wife passed. Just quieter than he used to be." She said it the way you say something you've been deciding whether to say. Then she moved on. "I'll be back Thursday. Eat the rest of that broth. Don't go in the well until your fever's been gone 3 days." She left the pot and drove back to her own claim in the thin afternoon light, and Evelyn sat in the warm house and ate the second bowl of broth and thought about Gideon Ashcroft, asking if anyone had seen her. She was up and working again by the end of the week. The fever left her a few pounds lighter, and with a cough that had improved mysteriously in its aftermath, as though the illness had burned through whatever was sitting in her chest and taken some of it with it. She still tired faster than before. She hated that. She'd push through a task and then have to sit down after, which felt like a betrayal by her own body, and she'd sit there with her jaw tight waiting to feel capable again. Gideon came on Thursday with the cedar insert for the well, the way he'd said he would. He also brought, without comment, a sack of dried beans and a small cured ham wrapped in cloth, which he set inside the door of the house before she could say anything about it. "You don't have to eat," she started. "I know," he said. She let it go. She watched him work the cedar insert into the east wall of the casing with a methodical patience that was almost meditative, the way a person works when they've done a thing 10,000 times and don't need to think about the individual movements anymore. The insert bowed outward perfectly against the earth pressure. He tamped it into place, checked it from 3 angles, found one spot he wasn't satisfied with, and redid it without being asked and without any visible frustration. "You've done this before," she said. "Couple 100 times," he said. "Had a well operation for 6 years before the lumber yard." "I didn't know that." "No reason you would." She handed him tools when he needed them, which he didn't ask for but accepted without comment. They worked in the cold in a silence that was, she recognized this, not uncomfortable. Most silences with people she didn't know well had a texture to them, a self-consciousness, the awareness that something probably ought to be said. This one didn't. It was just two people doing a thing that needed doing. When he finished, he tested the casing twice and declared it solid. "Should hold through the thaw," he said. "Check it in April." "I will," she said. Then, because she'd been thinking about how to say it, "I heard you asked about me in town." He looked at her. He didn't seem embarrassed by it. "You'd been out of sight a while," he said. "Wanted to know if there was a problem." "There was, actually. I was sick." "I know," he said. "Doris told me after." He paused. "You all right now?" "Better." He nodded. He coiled the spare cedar strips and set them on the woodpile where they'd stay dry. She thought he might leave then. That was his pattern, finish the thing and go. But he didn't immediately move toward his horse. "You've got more here than most people manage in the first year," he said. He said it in the same tone he used for everything, matter-of-fact and without ornamentation. "Well, solid. Walls are holding. You've got enough put by to make it to spring." She didn't know quite what to say to that. Not because it wasn't good to hear, it was more than she would have expected, but because it was so plainly meant. No performance in it, just a man saying what was true because it was true. "Thank you," she said, "for all of it. The fence, the wood, all of it." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Land like this'll give back what you put in. Takes a while to believe that when you're in the middle of it." "I'm starting to believe it," she said. He picked up his coat from where he'd draped it on the well frame. "Good," he said. He rode back toward town in the low January light, and she stood at the well and watched him go, and this time the complicated middle feeling was simpler than it had been before. It was simpler because she'd named more of it. Not all of it, but more. February was a test. Not a single catastrophic test, not one storm or one disaster, but a sustained, grinding accumulation of small things, which she was beginning to understand was actually harder than a single catastrophic thing. A catastrophe you rise to. A grind you just have to outlast. The southeast corner of the roof gave part way, not a collapse, but a settlement that let cold in along 8 feet of the top of the east wall. She repaired it 3 times before she found the combination of packed sod and straw bracing that actually held. The water in the well dropped by 3 feet over the course of the month, which frightened her more than she let herself acknowledge, and then came back up again in the last week, which she wrote about in the journal with considerably more relief than she usually allowed herself on paper. She ran out of coffee on February 18th. She noted this in the journal with a single sentence that was probably the most emotionally honest thing she'd written all winter. Out of coffee. Miss it more than I expected. Miss a lot of things I expected to miss less. Doris Kinsel visited twice more in February, each time with food and the no-nonsense manner of a woman who had decided, without announcing it, that Evelyn was worth checking on. She also brought, the second time, a small bag of coffee beans, which she handed over with an expression that said plainly that it was not a gift requiring emotional acknowledgement. "For my own supply," Doris said. "Don't make it a habit." "I won't," Evelyn said. "You look better than January." "I am better." Doris looked around the house the way she did, inventory style, efficiently. "North brace is still holding? Solid?" Doris sat down on the single stool, Evelyn's only seating besides the sleeping platform, and looked at her directly. "Hale's been talking." Evelyn, who had been grinding the coffee beans, went still. "What kind of talking?" "The kind where he mentions your name and then mentions how hard the winter's been." Doris said it flat and clear. "His man Renner was in the store last week suggesting it was a shame about the Mercer place, that it was looking rough." "It's not looking rough." "I know that and you know that," Doris said. "I'm telling you what's being said." Evelyn set the ground coffee down and looked at her. "He's still trying to buy the land. He's trying to build a story," Doris said, and there was a sharpness to it that made clear she'd thought about this more than once. "A story where you're struggling and the land's a problem, and by spring everyone's already half expecting you to sell. So when the offer comes again, it doesn't look like pressure. It looks like mercy." Evelyn was quiet for a moment. She picked the coffee back up and finished grinding it, slower than before, while she thought. "He's patient," she finally said. "He is," Doris agreed. "He waited out Alderman for 2 years." "And Alderman left?" "Alderman left," Doris said. "But Alderman also didn't fix his fence in December, or case his well in January. She paused. People in town aren't blind. They see what you've done out here. Not all of them are pulling for Hale. That was, Evelyn thought, probably the most direct statement of support she'd received since arriving. She made coffee for both of them, and they sat in the small, warm house while the February wind did what February wind did outside. And Doris talked about cattle prices and the spring planting calendar and the particular stubbornness required of anyone trying to run a claim in this county, and Evelyn listened with the quiet attention she gave to things that mattered. When Doris left, Evelyn stood in the doorway and watched the wagon move down the snow-packed road, and she thought about what Doris had said. Not the warning about hail, but the last part. People in town aren't blind. It was a small thing, but it felt like the beginning of something. Down. She made it to March. Not gracefully. The last week of February had stripped the grace out of it entirely, with a 2-day freeze that cracked the patching on the east wall again, and a night cold enough that she woke at 3 a.m. to find the water bucket had frozen solid a foot from the stove. But she made it. The first day of March was warmer than anything she'd felt since October. Not warm, maybe 38 degrees, but the sun was at a different angle, and the light had a quality to it that was distinct from winter light, a faint suggestion of the longer days coming. She stood outside the soddy with the coffee pot in both hands, and tilted her face toward the sun, and stood that way for longer than was probably efficient. When she opened her eyes, she saw that the first post on the south fence line, the one she'd been meaning to reset since November, was newly set and tamped, the earth around its base fresh and dark where it had been worked. She looked at it for a while. Then she went inside and got her coat and her journal, and she wrote, March 1st, south fence post reset, warmer today, first real light in weeks. Still here. Crop planting begins tomorrow. She underlined still here once, just the once. The land was still brown and dormant and cold, and there were 4 weeks minimum before the ground would be workable, and she had more problems than she could solve simultaneously, and a cough that came and went, and a woodpile that was going to need serious replenishment before next winter. But the days were getting longer. The sun was at a new angle, and somewhere, 3 miles down the road, a man who said almost nothing had reset her fence post before sunrise and gone back to his yard without saying a word about it. Spring was coming. Whatever it brought, she intended to be ready for it. Spring came to the plains the way spring always came out there. Reluctantly, in pieces, taking back its progress every 3rd day with a late frost or a cold rain that turned the broken soil to mud and made the work twice as hard. But it came. Evelyn broke ground on the south acreage in the 3rd week of March, when the frost had gone deep enough out of the soil that the earth worked without crumbling. She'd borrowed a single-bottom plow from Floyd Thane in exchange for helping his wife put up shelving in their storage room, a trade that took half a day and saved her money she didn't have. She worked the soil in long, slow passes, the plow horse she'd hired from Rob's livery pulling steady and indifferent while she walked behind and read the ground the way she'd taught herself over the winter. The color of it, the way it broke, how it smelled when it turned. The northeast quadrant was everything Victor Hale had said it was. The soil went from workable to heavy and compacted within 20 feet of the low spot, and in the lowest section it was still waterlogged enough to pull at her boots. She didn't try to plan it. She noted it in the journal and moved on. There would be a way to address it eventually. She'd read about drainage channels, about the way some farmers had cut shallow ditches to redirect the runoff. But not this season. This season she planted what she could and left what she couldn't. She planted 20 acres of winter wheat and 12 acres of sorghum, which Doris Kinsel had told her held up better in dry years than corn and didn't require the same depth of soil. She planted kitchen vegetables in a small bed south of the house, potatoes, turnips, onion sets, a row of beans along the fence line where they'd have something to climb. She planted all of it in the 2 weeks between frost dates that the almanac suggested, working from first light to when the light failed. Coming inside each evening with hands that ached in a particular way, she was beginning to recognize as progress. Gideon came out twice during planting. Neither time did he announce himself ahead of time. The first time he brought seed, winter rye, a 10-pound sack, which he set in the barn space at the end of the house without making a speech about it. The second time he came to look at the northeast drainage problem himself, walking the low ground in his boots with his hands in his coat pockets, stopping in 3 places to press his heel into the soil and watch how quickly the impression filled with water. Need a channel from here. He pointed southeast. To here, maybe 18 inches deep, sloped at about 2 degrees. I know, she said. I'm not getting to it this year. No, he agreed. But next year, before the melt. I'll remember. He looked at her. You want me to write it down? I write everything down, she said, and something in the way she said it made him almost smile. Not quite, but the corners of his eyes changed slightly. And that was enough. She planted the rye in the field behind the house, the one with the best drainage and the deepest topsoil. By the end of April, the first green was coming up in thin uniform lines across the turned earth, and she stood at the edge of the field in the morning and looked at it with the particular feeling of a person who has done a thing and had it work, which is different from confidence and better than relief, something quieter than both. The town thawed with the ground. Evelyn had noticed over the winter that the way people spoke to her in Dry Creek Ridge tracked closely with the weather, not in a simple cause and effect way, but with the logic of a community that paid attention to who was still there when things got hard. In September, she'd been a novelty. In November, a mild curiosity with doubtful prospects. By February, she'd been the topic of Hank Pruitt's convenient pessimism and Victor Hale's patient narrative. But March changed something. Floyd Thane, who'd accepted her trade for the plow without much warmth, stopped her on the street in late March and asked straightforwardly how the south acreage had broken. She told him. He asked about the northeast low spot, and she told him what Gideon had said about the drainage channel, and he nodded and said the Whitmore place had a similar problem, and Amos Whitmore had cut a channel 3 years back that had solved most of it. He said it like information being offered, not a lesson being delivered, which was different from how he'd spoken to her before. Ada Wren, at the post office, had always been civil but reserved. In April, she handed Evelyn a seed catalog that had come addressed to a former resident and said, "No one to claim this. You might find something useful." It was a small thing. It was also not nothing. Even Olin Meeks, who ran the general store with the careful neutrality of a man who didn't want to be on the wrong side of anyone's eventual story, had begun to extend credit without the pinched expression he'd used in the fall. He didn't say anything about it. He just wrote the amounts in his ledger and handed over the goods and moved to the next customer. The one person whose behavior didn't change was Hank Pruitt. He remained what he had always been, a man with a surplus of opinions and a deficit of information, and Evelyn had arrived at a comfortable equilibrium with him that consisted primarily of not engaging. He made remarks. She was not there for them. It was efficient. What did change, and noticeably, was the behavior of Victor Hale's man, Renner. Renner had been coming into town roughly once a week all winter, buying supplies and having conversations that seemed casual but tracked. Evelyn had noticed, suspiciously close to the topic of her land. He was a lean, quiet man with a thin mustache and the kind of eyes that moved slightly faster than the rest of his face, and he had a gift for saying things that weren't quite statements and weren't quite questions. The kind of talk that plants a thought without owning it. He'd say things like, "The Northeast claim must be rough after a winter like this one," and let the room fill in the rest. In April, Renner stopped coming by himself and started showing up with a second man named Tully, who said nothing at all but was large in a way that changed the feeling of a room. Evelyn clocked this shift and noted it. She mentioned it to Gideon the next time he came to town when she happened to be there. They were standing outside the lumber yard, and she'd been there for boards for a shelving project inside the house, and he'd been loading a customer's order and had stopped when she came in. She told him what she'd noticed about Renner and Tully. He listened without interrupting. Then he said, "Hale's not going to do anything direct." "I know that," she said. "He's too careful." "But he's getting impatient," Gideon said. 2 springs now, he hasn't gotten the land. He paused. "He may be through with waiting." "What does that mean, exactly?" Gideon looked at her in that steady, measuring way. "It means be careful with your boundary markers. Don't let your fence go unwalked. If any of your line posts move, notice it." She looked at him. "He'd tamper with survey markers?" "I'm not saying what he'd do," Gideon said. "I'm saying notice things." She thought about that for a long moment. The planting was in the ground. The crop was coming up. She had a working well and patched walls and 8 months of surviving on this land, and Victor Hale had more money than she'd see in a lifetime and had been patient for 2 years already. "All right," she said. "And Evelyn." He didn't use her name often. It stopped her. "You've got more people watching out than you know." She didn't ask him to be more specific about that. She had a feeling he wouldn't be, and she had enough to think about already. Botam. The first year's wheat harvest was modest. Not a failure. The stands had come in reasonably even, and the heads had filled out decently. But modest, the way a first attempt at something difficult is modest. She took the grain to Olin Meeks, who served as the area's informal grain agent, and he gave her a fair price that left her enough to carry through winter with some margin. The sorghum did better. Doris Kinsel had been right about that. The deep-rooted stalks had come through the dry August without the wilting she'd seen in the wheat, and the yield per acre was enough to make her think seriously about expanding it the following year. She wrote the numbers in the journal. Revenue, expenses, what she owed, what she had. The math was tight, but it worked. It worked by the smallest margin she'd ever been comfortable with, but it worked. She began planning the second year before the first year was even fully in. This was a habit she'd developed over the winter. The mental practice of being 2 seasons ahead, holding the current season's problems in one hand and the next season's preparation in the other. It was exhausting in a particular way, but it was also, she thought, the thing that was keeping her viable when other homesteaders weren't. The Northeast Drainage Channel went in during the 2nd October, before the ground froze. She did most of it herself, 2 weeks of hard digging with a spade and a long-handled hoe, working the slope the way Gideon had described, and the way Amos Whitmore had confirmed from his own experience. She got it roughly right, not perfect, and the first winter it only partially functioned because she'd misjudged the grade by a fraction, but she corrected it in the spring, and by the second spring the low ground was draining the way it was supposed to. Gideon checked her grade calculation on a Saturday afternoon in October, crouching in the half-dug channel with a length of string and a small level he carried in his coat pocket. He found the error and told her where to add slope without any particular satisfaction in being right about it. Just the information, plainly given. "You want help finishing this?" he said. She considered it. She'd been wrestling with herself about accepting help all summer, accepting it when she needed it, which she was learning to do, but being clear in her own mind about the difference between help freely given and dependence that would hollow out what she was building. She didn't think help from Gideon fell into the second category. She was pretty sure it never had. "Yes," she said. They finished the channel that Saturday and part of Sunday. She made coffee both days, and they took it standing up, looking at the work, and she thought that there were worse ways to spend a weekend in October on the Nebraska plains. Receipt. The second winter was the bad one. She knew it was coming before it arrived. The sky had a particular quality in November that year, a heaviness that sat lower than usual and didn't move. And the cattle in the far fields were doing what cattle did before a hard winter, which was eating everything they could reach. Doris Kinsel told her in October that the old-timers were predicting the worst winter in 15 years, which Evelyn took seriously because Doris did not traffic in exaggeration. She prepared more aggressively than she had the year before. She cut and split 2 full cords of wood before the first freeze, piling it against the north and west walls of the house under canvas. She patched every gap she could find in the walls, went over the roof with new sod cut from the draw, restocked her provisions to last 4 months instead of 3. She deepened the well another 3 feet before the ground froze, which added a week of exhausting work but gave her a margin on the water level that winter could pull at without threatening the supply. She felt, going into that winter, more prepared than she had any right to feel. She felt almost ready. The plains, as it turned out, did not care about her readiness. The first real storm came on December 5th and lasted 4 days. 4 days in which the wind came from the northwest at a sustained velocity that Evelyn had no reference for. Not like the previous winter's storms, but something different, lower and more powerful. A constant pressure that vibrated the walls of the soddy in a frequency she could feel in her sternum. She burned through wood faster than she'd planned because she couldn't get the stove to hold temperature. The wind interference with the flue was worsening the draw, which she didn't fully understand until she thought it through and realized the problem was the direction, not the stove. She fixed it on the 3rd day in a pause between the heaviest gusts, climbing onto the roof to angle the flue cap differently. A 20-minute repair that left her hands so cold she couldn't close them properly for an hour afterward. But the stove drew better after that, and she recalculated her burn rate and adjusted. The fever came back in January. Not as bad as the year before, but bad enough. Came on a Tuesday, and she knew by Wednesday morning that she wasn't going to be able to push through it the way she sometimes pushed through the milder version of herself. There was a difference between tired and sick and genuinely sick, and she knew the difference by now. She got herself water, got the stove loaded, and spent 2 days in the sleeping platform with all her blankets and the wool coat on top of them. Doris came on the third day. This time Evelyn wasn't even surprised. "You're an efficient person," Evelyn said, from the sleeping platform, when Doris came through the door. "Ashcroft sent word you hadn't been in town," Doris said, setting her covered pot on the stove. "Of course he did. He'd have come himself, but I told him I'd handle it." Doris looked at her, that inventory look. "You're not as bad as last year." "I'm not," Evelyn agreed. "Mostly I'm angry about it." "Good," said Doris. "Angry is useful. Stay angry." She stayed angry. It was, she found, actually useful. The irritation at her own body's failure was a kind of fuel that worked when she had nothing else, and she was back on her feet by day 5, not at full capacity but functional, which was what mattered. What she came back to was a woodpile that had gone down faster than she'd expected, even with her adjusted calculations. She'd been burning more on the days she was sick. She hadn't been managing it carefully, and the margin she'd planned for was gone. She had, she calculated, about 10 days of firewood left, and she was in the worst of the winter. She sat in the house with the journal open and did the math 3 times and got the same answer each time. She could ration tighter, burn only what was necessary to keep the temperature above the minimum survival threshold, which was roughly 35 degrees inside. That would extend the wood by 4 or 5 days. She could also burn the old rotted fence posts she'd pulled and stacked behind the house, which weren't ideal fuel but would burn. That gave her another 2, maybe 3 days. That still left her short. She was thinking through what came next, whether she could get to town in the current conditions, whether she had anything left to trade, when she heard boots on the stoop. She opened the door, and Gideon was standing there in a coat caked with frost along the shoulders, and behind him, on the road, was a wagon loaded with split wood, a full cord, maybe more. Dale from the lumberyard was up on the seat, hunched into his collar against the cold. Evelyn looked at the wood, then at Gideon. She felt something move through her that was not gratitude exactly. It was bigger than that and more complicated, and it sat in her chest next to the fear she'd been managing for the past 3 days and made both things feel different at the same time. "You can't keep doing this," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. "You need wood," he said. "I know I need wood. I'm going to pay you for it. I'm going to pay you for all of it. Every post, every board, every spool of wire. I'm keeping track." "I know you are," he said. He said it without argument, and somehow that was worse and better at the same time, because he wasn't being generous in a way that dismissed her accounting of things. He just thought the wood mattered more right now than the discussion about the wood. "Come inside," she said. "Both of you." Dale came in gladly. He was 17 and cold, and the offer of a warm room was not one he was going to refuse. Gideon came in and stood near the stove with his coat still on and accepted coffee without sitting down. They unloaded the wood by relay, with Dale handing logs from the wagon bed to Gideon to Evelyn, who stacked them against the interior wall where they'd stay dry. It took 40 minutes. When they were done, the stack against the wall was tall enough to put 2 weeks of hard burning behind her with margin. Dale drove the wagon back. Gideon stayed, not because anyone invited him to stay, but because he looked at the stove and then at the flue pipe and said, "That draw's still giving you trouble?" "Some," she said. "Let me look at it." He looked at it. He had an opinion, which he explained in his way, the minimum number of words that carried the full information, and she listened and asked 2 questions, and they settled on a fix that required a metal shim that he had in his coat pocket, which suggested to her that he'd been planning to look at the flue when he came. She didn't say that, she just watched him work. "Why do you have a flue shim in your coat pocket?" she said when he was nearly done. He glanced back at her. "Habit," he said. "Is it?" He finished with the shim, tested the draw. It was noticeably better, the stove pulling cleanly, and turned around. He was standing close in the small room. Not uncomfortably close, just close in the way people get close in small spaces. Close enough that she was aware of him in a way she'd been carefully not being aware of him for several months. "Gideon," she said. "Evelyn." She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her the same way. She thought about the first time she'd come into his lumber yard and he'd adjusted her lumber order without being asked, and the fence he'd fixed in the dark, and the wood stacked against her north wall in December, and the way he'd crouched in her drainage channel with a level and a string without making her feel incapable for needing the help. "I'm going to be here," she said, "in the spring, in the summer. I'm going to be here next winter and the one after. The land is mine, and I intend to keep it." "I know," he said. I'm telling you because... She stopped, found the words. Because I want you to know it's not fragile. I'm not fragile, whatever this is. She gestured slightly, meaning the wood and the shim and the last 14 months of him showing up, which was not a thing she had language for yet. It doesn't need to be handled carefully. He was quiet for a moment. In the stove, the fire drew cleanly and steadily, the way it was supposed to. I know you're not fragile, he said. That was clear by December of the first year. Then why do you keep... Because I want to, he said. Simple, without performance. She looked at him for a long moment. All right, she said. Then I won't argue with it. Something in the room settled, not resolved. It wasn't that simple, and neither of them was the kind of person who arrived at simple, but settled. The way a thing settles when both people have said the thing they needed to say, and it didn't go wrong. He stayed another hour. She made more coffee. They sat, she on the sleeping platform, he on the stool, and talked about the drainage channel and the spring planting and whether the sorghum yield had been good enough to justify more acreage or whether she should balance it differently. Practical, specific talk. The kind of talk she had come to recognize as one of the ways this particular man showed that he was actually there, actually paying attention. When he left, the wind had dropped below gale. The fire held temperature well. The wood stacked against the wall would carry her through February. She wrote in the journal that night, January 19th, wood restocked, flue fixed, draw is good, temperature holding at 48 inside. Talked with G for an hour, planning plans, drainage. Something settled tonight. Not sure I have better words than that. Still here. Cheat. She made it through February. March came, same as the year before, reluctant, in pieces, taking back its warmth every third day. But the wheat she'd overwintered was coming up in the south field, thin green lines across the brown. The drainage channel was working the way it was supposed to. The well held its level. The walls held. She walked the property on the first day of March, the full perimeter, the way she did at the beginning of every month. She checked every fence post, every section of wire, every corner marker. All of it was exactly where it was supposed to be. She stood at the northeast corner of the property, the corner furthest from the house, the one that looked out toward the flat horizon where Hale's land began somewhere past the grass, and looked at what she'd built, what she'd made from a leaning house and a broken well and 160 acres of ground that everyone had told her would never give back what she put in. It wasn't much, viewed from the outside. A solid soddy, a working well, a drainage channel, 32 acres under cultivation, a vegetable bed, good fences. It wasn't much. But it was hers. Every plank of it, every post, every turned furrow. The work was in it the way work gets into things when you do it yourself and do it right. And that was not nothing. That was in fact everything. She walked back to the house. The coffee pot was on the stove and the fire was going, and outside the spring light was doing its thing with the plains. The low oblique light that made the dormant grass look almost gold. The sky, that particular high blue that only happened in early March at this latitude. She had one more year of proving herself before the claim would be fully filed and the land would be hers by law as well as by labor. One more year. She thought about Victor Hale's patience. She thought about Renner and Tully and the careful story being built in town about her prospects. She picked up the coffee pot and poured a cup and thought, let him be patient. I'm not going anywhere. The third spring came in the way the previous two hadn't, cleanly, with conviction, like it meant it this time. The frost broke in the second week of March and stayed broken, and by the end of the month the south field was showing green in every row, and the drainage channel was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, carrying the snowmelt east along the cut grade and away from the low ground that had waterlogged her northeast quadrant for the first two growing seasons. Evelyn expanded her planting that year, not recklessly. She'd watched enough optimistic homesteaders overextend in a good spring and pay for it in a dry summer to know that expansion needed to be calibrated, not hopeful. She added 14 acres to the sorghum, kept the wheat acreage the same, and broke new ground in the northwest corner for a second vegetable bed that she intended to trade from rather than just eat from. She did the math the way she always did. On paper, in the journal, revenue projections against seed cost and labor, and the carrying price she'd need to make a profit rather than just survive. The numbers for the first time came out ahead, not dramatically, not in a way that would impress anyone looking in from the outside, but the margin was real, and it was positive, and it was built on 2 years of learning this specific land, its wet spots and dry spots, the way the northwest wind hit the south field differently than the east field, the week in August when the temperature dropped enough to stress the wheat if it wasn't at the right stage. She knew this land now in a way that no one could know it from the outside. Not Victor Hale, with his 12 miles of cattle range and his patient money. Not Cass Hargrove, who'd sold it to her without mentioning what was wrong with it. She knew it because she'd spent 2 winters inside it and 2 summers working it, and that knowledge was not transferable and not purchasable. And it was, she thought, the most valuable thing she owned. Doris Kinsel came out in April to see the planting layout. She walked the south field with Evelyn in her practical way, stopping to crouch down and look at the wheat seedlings, pressing her thumb into the soil and reading it. "You corrected the drainage," she said. "Second winter. It took 2 seasons to work right." Doris stood and looked at the northeast quadrant, the ground that had been waterlogged now showing the faint regularity of the drainage channel's effect, the soil color more uniform than it had been. "Amos Whitmore's been trying to solve his for 5 years," she said. "I'll send him your way." "He's welcome any time," Evelyn said. Doris looked at her for a moment with that reading expression. "You're past the hardest part," she said. It wasn't congratulations exactly. It was more like an assessment, the same tone she'd used to describe weather or soil conditions. "Second and third winters are what break people. After that, you've either learned the land or you haven't." "I haven't learned all of it," Evelyn said. "No," Doris agreed, "but you know enough. That's different from when you got here." It was. Evelyn knew it was. The difference wasn't confidence. She'd had a certain kind of confidence when she arrived, the Boston kind, the kind that came from education and preparation and the theoretical knowledge of things. What she had now was different, harder to name. Something more like the specific gravity of a person who has been tested by a particular place and found out what they were actually made of rather than what they'd assumed. It wasn't all good. She'd found things out about herself over 2 winters that she'd have preferred not to know. The stubbornness that was sometimes useful and sometimes just inflexible. The difficulty she had asking for help before things got critical. The tendency to manage everything internally until the internal management cost more than it saved. She'd gotten better at some of it. Not all of it. But she was here. The land was working. And Doris Kinsel, who did not say things she didn't mean, had told her she was past the hardest part. The trouble with Hale came to a head in May, which was when she'd half expected it to, because May was when the planting was in and the year's trajectory was becoming visible, and a man who'd been building a story about the Mercer claim's failure would have needed to either act on it or abandon it. She found the survey stake on the 15th of May. She was walking the north fence line. She did it monthly, the way Gideon had suggested, checking posts and wire and corner markers, when she noticed that the northeast corner post was not where it had been in April. Not moved dramatically, 6 inches, maybe 8. But northeast corner stakes defined the boundary between her claim and the land to the north, and 6 inches at the corner translated to a meaningful strip along the entire north line. She stood looking at it for a long time. Then she walked back to the house, got her journal, and went back to the corner and wrote down everything she could measure or observe. The position of the post relative to the original marker stones she'd laid the previous year, the angle of the fence wire, the condition of the disturbed soil around the base. She drew a rough diagram. She went to town the next morning. Cass Hargrove was at the post office when she came in, which saved her time. She spread her diagram on his counter and told him what she'd found. He looked at it. He looked at her. He had the expression of a man who understood immediately what he was being shown and was calculating several things at once, none of which he was going to say out loud. "Could have shifted in the spring thaw," he said. "It could have," she said. "Except the original marker stones I set last spring are still in the ground 2 inches from where the post is now. The post moved. The stones didn't." Hargrove was quiet. "Cass," she said, and she used his first name deliberately because she wanted him to hear that this was not a formal complaint, but a direct conversation between 2 people who both knew what was happening. "I need the survey record from when the claim was originally staked. I need to know the exact boundary coordinates." "That's county land office business," he said. "I know where the county land office is," she said. "I'm asking if you have the survey record in your files, because if you do, it saves me a 2-day trip to the county seat." He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he went to the back of his office and came back with a folded document that he spread on the counter. The survey record from 1874, when the Alderman claim had been originally staked. The coordinates were precise, recorded by a county surveyor named Briggs, not Cal Briggs from the blacksmith, she checked. And they clearly put the northeast corner of her claim 8 inches further northeast than where the post was now sitting. I'll need a copy of this, she said. I'll have Dale make one, he said, and then seemed to realize he meant someone else's Dale, not Gideon's, and corrected himself. I'll copy it myself, tomorrow. Today, she said. Not aggressive, just clear. He copied it. She folded it into her satchel. On her way out, she stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. I've been on this land 2.5 years, she said. I fixed everything that was broken and built what wasn't there. I know every foot of it. If one more post moves, I'll be at the county land office with documentation before the week is out, and I'll be asking questions about who filed what and when. Cass Hargrove said nothing. But he heard her. That was sufficient. She went to Gideon's yard next. He was in the back working, and he looked up when she came through. The northeast corner post moved, she said, 8 inches. His face didn't change much, but his eyes did. A sharpening, a focusing that she'd come to recognize as Gideon taking something seriously. You document it? Everything I could measure. I have the original survey record now, too. He was quiet for a moment, then, he won't do it again. Not now that you've got the survey record and you've told Hargrove you know. He paused. He's testing to see if you're paying attention. I'm paying attention, she said. I know. Now he knows. She stood in the yard for a moment, the frustration of it still sitting in her chest. Not fear. She'd moved past fear with Hale somewhere around the second winter, but a cold, specific anger at the patience and calculation of a man who moved a fence post 8 inches and then waited to see what a woman on her own in a soddy 3 miles from town would do about it. I want to put cedar posts on all 4 corners, she said. Deep set, with the coordinates carved into the face. Gideon almost smiled. I'll cut them, he said. They set the corner posts the following Saturday, the 2 of them working from the survey coordinates, Gideon with the level and the string, and Evelyn tamping and backfilling and making sure the coordinates were correct before she let him move to the next one. It took all morning. The posts went in solid and deep, the carved coordinates facing outward, not subtle, not ambiguous, a clear and visible statement that this land was documented and measured and watched. When they finished, they stood at the northeast corner and looked out at the flat land to the north, the direction of Hale's range. He'll see them, Gideon said. That's the point, Evelyn said. Be it. By summer, the town had shifted. It was gradual, and she wouldn't have been able to name a single day when it happened, but at some point in the 3rd year, the town stopped watching her the way it watched an uncertain prospect and started treating her the way it treated a fact. The distinction was real, and it showed up in small ways. The way Olin Meeks discussed pricing with her now, farmer to merchant, not begrudging charity. The way Floyd Thane sent a man to her when a customer needed drainage advice because he'd heard she'd solved the Northeast low ground problem. The way Ada Wren at the post office had started saving her the agricultural bulletins that came through on the assumption that Evelyn would want them, which she did. Amos Whitmore came out in June, sent by Doris as promised. He was a big, weathered man in his 50s with enormous hands and very little small talk, and he walked her drainage channel for 20 minutes without saying much, and then said, "That grade there, the last section, how'd you calculate it?" She told him. He listened with the concentrated expression of someone doing arithmetic in their head. Then he nodded. "I've got a similar problem running east-west," he said. "Could I bring my boy out to look at yours?" "Come whenever you want," she said. He brought his son the following week, a young man named Cyrus who was maybe 20 and who asked intelligent questions and took his own measurements and thanked her in a way that was genuine and slightly awkward, the way young men thank women for knowledge they expected to get from other men. She didn't make a thing of it. She just answered the questions. The Whitmores began trading with her after that. Eggs for grain, labor for seed, the informal economy of neighboring claims that she'd been mostly outside of for 2.5 years. It wasn't friendship exactly, but it was something real, built from the mutual recognition of people who worked adjacent ground and had discovered that the other person was competent. Hank Pruitt remained Hank Pruitt. He'd made a remark in the Feed and Grain in June. Something about how city women who got lucky with a crop liked to give advice to people who'd been farming since before they could walk. And Evelyn had been 2 aisles over and had considered her options and said, without raising her voice, "Mr. Pruitt, I've been breaking ground for 3 years and my drainage channel works. You're welcome to come look at it if you want to solve your Westfield problem. The room had been quiet for a moment. Hank Pruitt had said nothing. A man she didn't recognize well had laughed once, short and surprised. She'd paid for her goods and left. Floyd Thane had caught her eye on the way out and given her a single nod that meant several things, most of them good. Gideon came out that summer more regularly, not always with materials or repairs, sometimes just with himself, which was its own kind of change. He came on Saturday afternoons when his yard was closed, and he would look at what she was doing and either help or watch and give an opinion when she asked for one. They ate together sometimes. She cooked, which she'd gotten considerably better at over 3 years of feeding herself on a frontier budget, and talked about the land and the town and the things that were happening in the county. He told her things, gradually, the way he did everything, in small amounts, never all at once. About his wife Margaret, who had died 6 years ago from a fever that had come and gone in a week, which was the kind of thing that happened out here and which he spoke about without the raw edge of recent grief, but with the permanent presence of an absence that had reshaped everything around it. About his son, who'd gone to Kansas 3 years ago and wrote irregularly and had built his own life in the way sons did, which Gideon spoke about with the complicated, uncomplicated love of a father who was proud and sometimes lonely and would not say the latter. She told him things in return, about Boston, about the man she'd been engaged to, a lawyer named Whitfield, who had the gift of making his preferences sound like her preferences, until she'd been 3 months from the wedding and had looked at the life she was about to have and realized she'd somehow agreed to something she hadn't chosen. About her mother, who had died when Evelyn was 22, and who had been the kind of woman who did things precisely, who kept the house ordered and the accounts straight and had the coffee pot that Evelyn still used because her mother had used it every morning of Evelyn's childhood. "That's why you brought it," Gideon said. He said it like he was placing a piece that had been sitting off to one side. "That's why I brought it," she said. He looked at the coffee pot on the shelf and then back at her, and the expression on his face was something she didn't have a word for, a kind of recognition or tenderness or both. The expression of a person who has just understood something important about another person and is holding it carefully. "It makes good coffee," he said. "It does," she said. And there was enough in that small exchange that neither of them needed to add to it. Victor Hale made his final offer in August. He came himself this time, without Renner, without Tully, on a Tuesday afternoon when the fields were at their best. The sorghum tall and green in the south quadrant, the wheat headed out in the north, the vegetable beds full and orderly, the cedar corner posts visible at every boundary. She thought he might have timed it that way deliberately, might have wanted to see the land at its peak so he could calculate what it was worth now versus what he'd offered 2 years ago. She was at the fence on the east side when he rode up. She set down the wire tool she'd been using and waited. He looked around the property the way he'd looked at it the first time, slowly, taking inventory. But the expression was different now. The paternal concern was gone. What was there instead was a kind of careful reassessment, the expression of a man who had underestimated something and was adjusting. "Miss Mercer," he said. "Mr. Hale." "The place looks well." "Thank you," she said, which was the minimum acceptable response and nothing more. He came down from his horse, which surprised her. He'd stayed mounted both previous times, the height differential a deliberate posture of authority. Coming down meant something else. She watched him, but didn't move toward him. "I'll come to it directly," he said. "I'd like to make a final offer for this claim, considerably higher than what I offered in '78. He gave her a number that was, she estimated, nearly 3 times what she'd paid for the land. She looked at him. She thought about the northeast corner post, moved 8 inches in the night. She thought about Renner and Tully at the general store, building a narrative. She thought about 2 winters and a fever and a woodpile running short and everything she dug and cut and patched and planted to get to the August afternoon she was currently standing in. "No," she said. Hale was quiet for a moment. He looked at the cedar corner post on the northeast boundary, the coordinates carved into the face in deep, clear letters, and something in his expression closed down. "You understand," he said carefully, "that there are challenges to operating a single-person claim in this county long-term. Market access, infrastructure, labor." "Mr. Hale," she said, and she said it with the same level tone she'd used on Hank Pruitt in the Feed and Grain, no heat in it, just clarity. You've been telling me for 3 years that this claim was going to fail. You moved my survey marker. You had your man spend a winter in town suggesting I was struggling. And I'm still here. The land is producing, and the answer is still no." He looked at her. There was a long pause. "I moved no markers," he said. "I documented it," she said. "Cass Hargrove has the survey record." Another pause. Longer. He looked at the fields, then at the house, then at her, and what she saw in his face in that moment was not anger. She'd expected anger, but something that looked almost like the particular uncomfortable experience of a man being accurately seen. "The offer stands," he said. "If you change your mind." "I won't," she said, "but I'll remember you came in person this time." He rode south. She watched him go until he was a shape on the horizon, and then a gap in the grass, and then nothing, the way the plane swallowed everything eventually. She picked up the wire tool and went back to the fence. That fall, she filed the completed Homestead claim at the county land office. 2 days on the road, the documentation that Hargrove had helped her compile, the years of journal records she'd been keeping since September of 1878, soil assessments, planting records, repair logs, receipts, everything. The county agent was a middle-aged woman named Sargent, which was her actual name, and she went through Evelyn's documentation with the thoroughness of someone who'd seen claims fail on paperwork and was not going to let that happen through carelessness. "This is organized," Mrs. Sargent said, after going through the third folder. "I kept records from the first week," Evelyn said. "Most people don't. Most people remember things differently than they happened when it matters." She looked up. "Any disputes on the boundary?" "There was an incident with the northeast corner post in May of the 3rd year," Evelyn said. She pulled out the diagram she'd drawn, the survey record copy, her own measurements. "I documented it at the time." Mrs. Sargent looked at the documentation. She looked at Evelyn. "Victor Hale's range abuts your north line," she said. "It does." A pause. "Your documentation is thorough," she said. It had the quality of a sentence that meant more than it said. "Thank you," Evelyn said. The claim was approved 3 weeks later. The deed arrived at the Dry Creek Ridge post office on a Thursday morning in October, and Ada Wren handed it to her with something that was unmistakably a smile. Not large, but real. "Congratulations, Miss Mercer," Ada said. Evelyn looked at the deed, at her name on it, at the legal description of the land, the boundaries, the acreage, the coordinates that matched the carved cedar posts on her 4 corners. She stood at the post office counter and held it for a moment. "Thank you, Ada," she said. She folded it into her satchel next to the original purchase deed and the survey record and went out into the October street. Dry Creek Ridge looked the same as it always had. The saloons facing each other, the feed and grain, the lumber yard at the south end with its familiar smell of fresh-cut wood. But the town felt different, and the way that places feel different when you're standing in them has changed. Olin Meeks came out of the general store as she passed and said, "Heard the claim went through." He said it like a statement of fact, but his face held something that was the closest Olin Meeks generally got to warmth. "It did," she said. "Good," he said. "You want to talk about a proper credit arrangement before winter? Not the season-by-season business, something more permanent." She looked at him. "I would," she said. "Come in Thursday," he said. She went to Gideon's yard. He was in the front doing a measurement on a board, and he looked up when she came through the gate. She held up the satchel. "It's filed," she said. "Deed came in this morning." He set down the measuring tape. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across the well on that January afternoon in the second winter when something had settled between them. That careful, full attention. "Good," he said. Then, "Come have coffee." She went in. They sat across from each other at the small table in the back of his office where he kept the books, and he poured the coffee and she set the deed on the table between them, and they both looked at it for a moment. 4 years, she said. 4 years, he agreed. "I didn't know if I could do it," she said. She said it because it was true and because she trusted him with the truth of it. "When I got here, I thought I knew if I could do it, but I didn't know, not really." He wrapped his hands around his cup. He looked at the deed, then at her. "I knew," he said. She looked at him. "When?" "December," he said. "First year. When you came in for the well lumber and you'd already read everything you could find and you were still wrong about the casing angle and you didn't argue when I told you." She thought about that. About herself in December of the first year, standing in the cold outside the lumber yard with her sleeves down and her hands raw. The woman who had no idea what she was doing and knew she didn't know and went ahead anyway. "That's a low bar," she said. "It's not," he said. And he said it quietly and without argument, the way he said things that were simply true. Outside, the October sun was doing what it did over the plains in the fall, going low and gold, making long shadows of everything. The lumberyard smelled of pine and cedar and cold air coming in under the door, and the coffee was hot. And across the table from her was a man who had shown up for 2 years in the dark before she was awake and asked nothing back except that she continue doing what she was already doing. She thought, this is what it looks like when something is real. Not announced, not performed, just present, consistent. Built from the same material as the fence posts and the drainage channel and the cedar corner stakes. "Gideon," she said. "Yeah. Next year I'm expanding the sorghum by 20 acres and I need a building for proper grain storage. Real lumber, not sod." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll work up a plan," he said. "Good," she said. She picked up her coffee. He picked up his. Outside, the sun kept going down, and the plains held its color for a long, long time before the dark came in. The grain storage building went up in the spring of the 4th year, the way Gideon had planned it through the winter. Framed lumber, proper foundation stones, a roof pitched to shed snow rather than collect it. He'd worked the design over 2 months, revising it twice before he was satisfied, and when he laid it out for her on paper at the table in his office. Back office, she'd looked at it and said it was bigger than she'd asked for. "You'll fill it," he said. "You don't know that." "The sorghum yield went up 18% last year," he said. "You're adding 20 acres. You'll fill it." She looked at the plans, then at him. "What if we have a bad year?" "Then you'll have a building that's too big for one bad year," he said, "and the right size for the year after." She didn't argue with it. She'd learned over 4 years of watching how Gideon Ashcroft thought about things, that he didn't plan for the good version of events. He planned for the shape of things over time, which was different, and which was usually right. They built it in April, Gideon and Dale, and a young man from town named Sorrel, who had strong arms and not much else to recommend him, but that turned out to be sufficient for framing work. Evelyn worked alongside them, not as labor direction, just as another pair of hands because it was her building on her land and she wanted to know every joint of it. Gideon didn't comment on this. Dale seemed mildly surprised. Sorrel didn't notice because Sorrel didn't notice much. It took 9 days. On the last day they raised the ridge beam, and Evelyn was on the ladder when it went up, holding the east end steady, while Gideon and Dale pinned the west. And when it seated into the posts with a solid thunk, she felt it through the wood and into her hands and thought, there. Just that. There. When Sorrel and Dale had gone back to town, and it was just the two of them in the late afternoon, Evelyn stood inside the empty building and looked at the framed walls and the clean lumber smell and the way the late light came through the gaps where the siding would go, striping the earthen floor in long bars of gold. "It's good work," she said. "It'll hold 40 years, Gideon said. He was checking a corner joint, pressing on it with his palm to test the set. "Maybe more." She looked at him for a moment, at the way he checked the corner with the same attention he gave everything, the same unhurried thoroughness. She'd been watching him work for 4 years, and it still struck her sometimes, that quality, the complete absence of performance in it. "You'll need to bill me properly," she said. "All of it, materials and labor." "I will," he said. "I mean it, Gideon." He turned from the corner and looked at her. "I know you mean it," he said. "I said I will." She held his gaze. He held hers. After a moment, she looked back at the building, because they were both people who found it easier to look at the thing they were talking about than at each other when the conversation was heading somewhere significant. "I want to talk about something," she said. "All right." She took a breath. "You've been coming out here for 4 years. You've put more of yourself into this place than I can account for, and I've tried to account for everything, and She stopped. Tried again. "I'm not good at this. I want to be clear about that. I'm better at building things than saying things." "I know," he said. It wasn't dismissive. It was just true. "I want you out here," she said, "not to fix things. Not because I need materials. I want you out here because—" She looked at him directly. "Because this is better when you're here. The work is better. The evenings are better. I am better, I think." She paused. "And I think you know that already. And you've been waiting for me to say it in a way I actually mean. Gideon was quiet for a long moment. Outside, the spring wind moved through the new siding gaps and the building breathed slightly around them, the wood settling into itself the way new buildings do. I've been waiting, he said, but not impatiently. No, she said. You've never been impatient about anything in your life, which is one of the things that's occasionally infuriating about you. He almost smiled, the corners of his eyes. You want me to be more impatient? No, she said. I want you to have coffee with me in the morning. I want you to tell me when my grade calculations are wrong before I've already dug 20 feet of channel. She stopped, and something in her expression settled, like the ridge beam settling into the posts. I want the life that's been accumulating between us for 4 years to stop being something we work around and start being something we choose. He looked at her for a long time. The light was going amber around them, coming through the siding gaps in thicker bars as the sun dropped, and she stood in it and waited with the particular patience she'd developed over 4 years on this land. The patience of someone who knew the difference between things that couldn't be rushed and things that shouldn't be. That's what I want too, he said, simply, without decoration. She nodded. He nodded. It was not a dramatic moment. It was, she thought, exactly the right kind. Two people saying a true thing in an unfinished building on a working farm, surrounded by the smell of new lumber and the sound of the wind. Victor Hale's operation began to contract that same spring, quietly and without announcement, which was how things happened in that county when they went badly for someone with a reputation to protect. The first Evelyn heard of it was from Ada Wren at the post office in May, who mentioned that the Box H had sold off its northernmost pasture land to a family from Iowa. Ada said it in the careful way of someone who has information and is offering it without theorizing about it. Evelyn took it the same way. Then Floyd Thane mentioned in June that Hale had let 3 of his regular hands go after Roundup, which was unusual for the Box H, which had kept a stable crew for years. Then Olin Meeks said, with the precision of a man whose credit ledgers told him things about the county that no newspaper could, that the Box H account was operating on considerably tighter terms than it had been 18 months prior. Evelyn didn't ask questions. She listened to what was offered and kept her own counsel. She had no satisfaction in it, or she tried not to. That wasn't quite honest. There was something when Olin mentioned the Box H account that she felt and that she acknowledged privately and then set down, because satisfaction in another person's difficulty was a weight she didn't want to carry. What she felt more cleanly was a kind of release, the way a tension you've held for a long time releases when it's no longer necessary. She mentioned it to Gideon one evening in July when they were sitting outside after dinner. She'd started cooking for both of them on the Saturdays he came out, and on some Tuesdays, and somewhere in there it had become a pattern that neither of them had formally decided, but both of them maintained. Hale's having trouble, she said. Gideon was looking at the northern fence line in the last of the light. Heard that, he said. Do you know what happened? Some of it, he said. He over-leveraged the cattle operation against land prices that didn't hold, borrowed against acreage he was planning to acquire. He paused briefly. Acreage that didn't become available. She looked at him. This land? Partly, he said. There were others, but he'd built a plan around expanding north and east, and the pieces didn't fall the way he expected. She was quiet for a moment. He had it all laid out, she said, before I even arrived. Before you arrived, Gideon said, this parcel would have gone to him for whatever he offered after Alderman left. There was no one else in line. He paused. Then you came. She thought about herself stepping off the stage in September of 1878 with a deed and a coffee pot and 3 men laughing at her in the street. She thought about how close the whole thing had been. How if the land had sat another 6 months, Hale would have acquired it quietly, and Cass Hargrove would have filed the papers, and no one would have noticed or cared. I didn't come here to stop him, she said. No, Gideon said. You came here for yourself. That's why it worked. She looked at the northern fence line, the cedar posts solid in the ground, the coordinates carved into the corner stakes. The evening light on the field made the sorghum look almost black-green, heavy and full, the stalks thick from the good wet spring. I still don't have it all figured out, she said. No one does, he said. The northeast quadrant still floods in a really wet year. The drainage helps, but it doesn't solve it completely. And I still want to expand the kitchen garden, but I can't manage it alone, and I can't afford hired help at the scale I'd need. Evelyn, he said. What? I know, he said. We'll sort it. We. She heard the word. He'd been using it for a while, since sometime in the winter, she thought, or maybe earlier, and each time it had landed with a quiet weight, the weight of a word being used by someone who meant it precisely. She hadn't been ready to meet it head-on until the conversation in the grain building. Now she could. We'll sort it, she said back, and meant it. The north fence needed its final section rebuilt before winter. Old posts, the original ones from the Alderman era that she'd been replacing gradually over 4 years, working east to west one section at a time. The last stretch ran along the top of the low-rise at the property's north edge, 30 yards of line that she'd left for last because it was the most exposed and because she'd wanted to be sure of the post placement before she committed to it. Gideon came out on the first Saturday of October for the final section. He arrived before full light, which was his way. She heard his horse on the road and was already up, already had the coffee on, and she came out and found him unloading posts from the wagon in the gray early morning dark, moving with the familiar easy efficiency of someone who knew the work so well it didn't require thinking. You're early, she said. There's a lot of posts, he said. She handed him a coffee. He took it, and they both stood in the cooling dark and drank it, looking north at the fence line they were about to rebuild, the old posts barely visible against the sky. They worked from east to west, digging the old posts, setting new ones, running the wire taut and even. She and Gideon had a rhythm by now. 4 years of working alongside each other had made it so that they didn't have to negotiate who did what or when. They just moved, and the work moved with them. It was the kind of efficiency that only comes from time, from enough shared labor that two people's working styles have worn smooth against each other like stones in a creek. By mid-morning, the sun was up and the air had warmed to something tolerable, and they were 3/4 through the section. Gideon set a post and tamped it and stepped back to check the line. Little east, Evelyn said, looking down the fence from 30 feet away. He adjusted, looked at her. Good, she said. They kept going. At noon, she brought out bread and cold smoked pork, and they sat on the rise and ate and looked at what they'd done. Behind them to the south, the farm spread out in the October light. The grain building with its pitched roof, the garden beds neatly closed down for the season, the south field stubbled from the harvest, the soddy with its patched walls and straight chimney, and the new wooden stoop she'd built to replace the original rotten one in the 3rd year. It looked from up here like something. It looked like a farm that had been worked by someone who understood it and stayed with it through the hard parts. Not beautiful in the magazine sense. It was plain and practical, and some of it was still rough around the edges, but solid, real. My father would have thought I'd lost my mind, Evelyn said. Gideon ate his bread and said nothing, which meant he was listening. He was a professor, she said. History. He had opinions about the frontier, about what it was and what it wasn't. He thought the Homestead movement was going to fail, not for the individuals, for the country, that it was too much space and not enough infrastructure, and the economics were wrong. Was he right? Gideon said. Partly, she said. A lot of claims fail. You know that as well as anyone. She looked at the farm. But he was wrong about what happens to the people who stay. He thought the land broke them. He didn't account for the people it didn't break. She paused. He never saw the ones it didn't break because they weren't the story he expected. Gideon looked at her. What would you tell him now? She thought about it for a moment, really thought about it. Not the polished answer, but the actual one. I'd tell him that I was wrong too, she said. I thought I came out here because I was brave, or because I had something to prove. But that wasn't it, not really. I came out here because I didn't know another way to find out what I actually was. She paused. Boston told me who I was supposed to be. I needed somewhere that didn't know me yet. She looked at the farm again. At the cedar post on the northeast corner, the coordinates carved into the face, the wire running taut to the post they'd set this morning. I found out I was stubborn, she said, and not very good at asking for help until things get bad. And I made mistakes I could have avoided if I'd been more careful. But I also found out I could fix things. That I was good at reading what a thing actually needed rather than what I wanted it to need. That's not nothing. It's not nothing, Gideon said. He said it in the way he said things that he meant completely. She looked at him. This man who had fixed her fence in the dark and brought wood in January and checked her drainage grade and said, "We'll sort it," with the easy certainty of someone who had already decided he was going to. You found me here, she said. "Of all the inconvenient places." "You weren't inconvenient," he said. "You were 3 miles down the road and you had a well that needed work." She laughed, a real one, short and genuine. He watched her laugh with the expression she'd come to know as his version of the same thing. They finished the fence in the mid-afternoon, the last post set and tamped and the wire run and stapled, the section complete from east corner to west. Gideon walked the line one final time, the way he always did, checking each post by hand, testing the wire tension at intervals. She walked it with him, 2 people checking the work together, finding one post that needed a half-inch of additional tamping and nothing else. When they reached the west end, they stopped and turned and looked at the complete fence line running along the top of the rise. 30 years of posts, all cedar, all plumb, the wire catching the afternoon light in a long straight glint. "That's the last of the alderman posts," she said. "All your fence now," he said. All her fence, all her land, the title filed, the deed in the drawer inside the house, the corner stakes with the coordinates carved into the face. 160 acres that had been waterlogged in one quarter and fallow in another and broken everywhere, and that she had, over 4 years, made into something that worked. She thought about Percy Alderson, driving her out here on that first September afternoon and sitting on the wagon seat with his careful silence, not saying what he'd been told not to say. She thought about Cass Hargrove's expression when she'd spread the land deed on his counter. She thought about Victor Hale on his good horse telling her the economics were wrong. She thought about Hank Pruitt and the 3 men who'd laughed on the day she arrived. She thought about Doris Kinsel, brisk and without sentimentality, showing up at her door with a covered pot, and the particular generosity of someone who helps because they think you're worth helping. She thought about Ada Wren and her almost smile, and the seed catalog she'd set aside without being asked. She thought about Amos Whitmore and his son Cyrus standing in her drainage channel doing arithmetic, and Floyd Thane's single nod in the doorway of the feed and grain. You couldn't do a thing like this alone. That was one of the things she'd had wrong at the start. Not the determination to do it, that part was right, but the idea that doing it meant doing it entirely yourself, that asking for help was a debt or a weakness or a concession. It wasn't. It was just what people were to each other out here, when they were being what they were supposed to be. You fixed the fence in the dark and you brought the broth, and you checked the drainage grade because the person on the other side of it was trying to build something real, and real things deserved real help. She'd learned that from this place, from this flat, plain, difficult, unbeautiful, specific land. She'd learned some of it from the man standing next to her. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." "All right," he said. They walked down the slope of the rise toward the house, through the stubbled field and past the grain building and across the yard where the morning's tools were leaned against the fence. The light was going the way October light went, sideways and golden and quick, the shadows stretching long before the cold came in. The chimney was putting out a thin line of smoke, white against the blue, because she'd banked the fire before they went up to the fence. She pushed open the door of the soddy, her door, on her hinges, hung by her hands on the second day she'd arrived, and went inside. The coffee pot was on the shelf where it always was. Her mother's coffee pot, dented and reliable, the one thing she'd carried here from the life before this one. She filled it from the water bucket, which was full because the well was working, and set it on the stove, which was warm because the fire was going, in the house that was standing because she'd repaired it wall by wall and season by season until the leaning became straight and the cold stopped getting in. Gideon came in and closed the door behind him. He hung his coat on the hook. He had a hook now. She'd put a second one up in the second year without commenting on it, and sat down at the table. Outside, the October sun kept doing what it was doing, going down over the plains in that long, slow way, throwing light across the fields and the fence lines and the grain building and the cedar posts at all 4 corners of the land, the coordinates carved clear and deep where anyone who came to claim what wasn't theirs would find out that someone had been here, someone had measured and worked and stayed. She set 2 cups on the table. She sat across from him. They waited for the coffee to be ready in the house that had once been broken and was now whole, on the land that had once been nothing and was now hers. Not a perfect life, not a smooth one. She was 32 years old and her hands were rougher than they'd ever been in Boston, and she still pushed herself too hard sometimes and asked for help too late and made decisions in the dark that she had to correct in the daylight. She was stubborn in ways that cost her. She was learning still what this land asked of her in each new season, and she suspected she would be learning for as long as she worked it, because land didn't run out of lessons. But she was here. She had chosen to be here, not by accident and not by default, but by the accumulated weight of 1,000 small decisions, each one made in the direction of staying, of building, of staying some more. The coffee pot began to hiss on the stove. Outside, the light lasted a little longer, the way it does in October on the Nebraska plains, holding on to the last of itself before the dark comes in from the east, and the temperature drops and the stars come out hard and bright over the grass. Inside, the fire was warm and the coffee was almost ready, and across the table was a man who had shown up again and again in all the ways that mattered. Some things you build from lumber and wire and packed earth. Some things you build from showing up in the dark before the other person is awake, from telling the truth about grade calculations, from saying we'll sort it and meaning exactly that. Both kinds hold. Both kinds last. That was the thing she'd needed 160 acres of hard ground to teach her. That what endures is not the thing built without cost or struggle, but the thing built anyway, by imperfect hands, in difficult weather, one season at a time. The coffee was ready. She poured it.